Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
We're here to interview Peter Gelderloos and Prince Shakur. Peter is an anarchist writer who recently published 2 books, one with Pluto Press called They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us, Forcing Nonviolence on Forgetful Movements, and the other with Detritus Books called Organization, Continuity, and Community. And Prince Shakur is the author of When They Tell You to Be Good. They're also an activist and co-host on the Black Anarchist podcast, The Dugout. So with that brief intro, for those who don't know, do you all want to add to that or tell us who you are and the work that you do generally? Prince, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, I'll start. I'm born and raised in Ohio. I've done a bunch of different movement work over the last 10 years, from student organizing to boycott organizing with labor unions, a lot of environmental work, a lot of racial justice work, a lot of mutual aid work. Yeah, and I mean, I think this year has definitely been a lot of work centered around like putting out Black anarchist ideology in media. Me and a bunch of folks here locally have been doing a lot of mutual aid and legal defense work related to the Boeing 5 case that has been happening here in Ohio with the folks that protested a Boeing facility, which has major ties to Israel. And yeah, thank you for having me here.
Thanks for being here. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Peter Gelderloos, not loose, and I grew up in Virginia, lived mostly in Catalonia, but also coming back, to the States frequently. And for the past couple of years, I've been living in Cleveland. Yeah, I do a lot of writing and movement research, and aside from that, have just been participating in social movements and different infrastructure projects or other anarchist projects wherever I happen to be living.
Well, thanks to both of you for coming on and talking with us. We're really interested in having a conversation about the context that we're moving into with Trump's new presidency, and also talking about anti-repression work that people are doing, while also including some of an awareness of kind of the past political movements and what we can learn from them. So this is sort of meant to be a long-form discussion around our current context, applying our previous context to it, and talking about some of the sort of emblematic cases that people are thinking about right now. To kick us off, I had a question for you, Peter. In the past, you've argued that Trump does not represent fascism in the classical sense of threatening and disrupting democracy, but instead represents a very different American project and a strengthening of white supremacy. And so I wanted to ask if you could clarify the distinction you're making there between American white supremacy and classical fascism, and why you're making that distinction. Like, what is lost or gained when we call Trump a fascist? And if your views have changed on this or not, or if you think that recent events have strengthened that argument.
Yeah, so for me, the question really relates to one of the topics I've been focusing on lately, which is the question of memory and intergenerational continuity in our struggles. Really the loss of memory and the lack of intergenerational continuity, these ruptures and this constant state of amnesia that we move through, which really puts us at a huge disadvantage. So it's important to remember how fascism ended in its original incarnation. The most powerful fascist states were defeated militarily. There were a couple that survived, and the longest lasting of those, and probably it could be considered like a tie between Portugal and Spain, but clearly the most politically significant and larger of those was the one in Spain. And in that one, fascists themselves voluntarily transitioned back into democracy. The ruling class realized that democracy was much more effective for its interests. Fascism arose at a time when there was considered to be a major danger of revolution. So a large part of the ruling and the owning classes decided to suspend democracy in order to try to avail themselves of kind of like no holds barred fight against these revolutionary movements. One thing that they hadn't seen yet was that statist revolutionary movements will control themselves. Like there's no such thing in the end as a statist revolution or a statist movement that's anti-capitalist. All of those, capital C communist revolutions came back around very quickly to capitalism, to state capitalism, where they never left it. And also, the context changed, part of the danger shifted, but in the end, like the ruling class saw that their interests were better served by democracy than by fascism. So the opposition isn't between white supremacy and fascism. All of these, European originating systems, all of the institutional framework of modernity, of like this entire global framework that we have in a political, economic, and cultural sense is all white supremacist. I think the point I was making in the article that I think you're referencing is about like the need in the U.S. that there's like a very strong history of anti-racist resistance and struggle in the U.S. and that Antifa was like an importation from a European context. It had plenty of errors in the European context. It also made more sense and was more effective in the European context, and that importation to the U.S. in the mid-aughts, the mid-teens, the last decade, was a big mistake because A, it didn't learn the lessons that were learned in the European context. B, it totally turned its back on a much stronger and more deeply rooted anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle, in the settler state that we live in. And C, it kind of got rid of the best thing about anti-fascism, which is the name. It's a very clear name. We're against fascism, for like this, like, trendy, dumb, like Antifa thing, which is just like a German shortening of anti-fascist. So it wasn't a very good move strategically. And it was kind of us participating in this loss of history, which is unfortunate when we do it too, because, capitalism is always like stealing our history. But the real opposition is between fascism or other kinds of dictatorship and democracy. There have been moments in the past, and there are regions of the world where pretty permanently the ruling classes will prefer dictatorship because, democracies can and do utilize the same level of violence that dictatorships do. Look at Israel right now is a great example, carrying out that genocide, but they need a way to portray it as exceptional. In Israel, that's through a huge amount of white supremacy and, control, over like media discourses. And in a settler state, it's easier to do that. In the U.S. also, like there's like constant use of dictatorial means and levels of violence against indigenous people, against black people. And again, white supremacy provides that kind of, it's not a state of exception. It's just an exception. I have very little doubt that, more parts of the world in the coming years or decades, will again enter a context in which it is more strategic for the ruling class to go back into, some kind of a dictatorship, some kind of, more permanent state of exception. But, we're seeing, still like an overall trend, like, not just in Europe and North America, but also like largely in South America, a more lasting adherence to democracy because of the special advantages that democracy brings to capitalism, to the ruling class, like a special set of tools, not just of repression, but also of recuperation. And so that kind of having that kind of counterinsurgency lens is really vital to understanding the actual strategic interests of the ruling class. To really quickly add on, like another problem with that is in 2016, 2017, a lot of people in the States were like warning about like a coming fascist takeover without, bothering to do the work of like really understanding like the difference between fascism and democracy and how democracy is not a good thing. Like democracy has always been like a system based on enslavement and militarism, but it just allows for more participation in our own exploitation and in the mechanisms of social control. And they were spreading these warnings, but not actually learning from the history of like resistance against fascism, not learning how anti-fascist united fronts were actually very effective tools of the institutional left to destroy revolutionary movements, and also, not getting these mechanisms ready for collective survival of like having to go on the run, having safe houses, having, good stashes, being like, more armed and all that. Like not enough of that was actually happening to like really take it seriously. It was just kind of alarmism. One good thing is that people nowadays, I think, are doing a better job of like understanding like, what the different kinds of, disaster that are already happening and that, will become more likely, what that's going to look like, what that is looking like, and how to survive that, collectively, how to fight back against that. So people are actually like, honing that down and like, we're doing a better job of preparing for it. I think like now, like we're definitely closer to that as a possibility than we were in like 2016, 2017. But like, again, like, I mean, Trump is an opportunist who was definitely like an authoritarian, not in a very strategic way, except out of his like very strictly personal interests. He's definitely the kind of person who undermines like standard democratic practice and democratic values. So he could certainly create like enough turbulence to allow for like a turn towards some kind of dictatorship. I mean, it probably wouldn't be fascism, like that was like pretty historically specific, but like, some other kind of dictatorship I think is more possible now than it was in 2016. I think I'd still give it less than a 50-50 chance for the next 4 years. What that kind of far right movement looks like. And again, far right, can be pro-democratic or it can be, pro-dictatorship. That's changed a lot. Like groups, formations like the Proud Boys are much less important. And I think we see like the more lasting danger and the more real danger are like Christian nationalists. But in like the people who are in Trump's orbit and who are using Trump to get more access to power, you have like a really wide range from people who are basically just corrupt politicians who want to operate in a democracy and whose interests are best served by some kind of democratic government, with, widespread corruption and, more tolerance of that, to folks like, what's his name, Pete Hegseth, the, vet and then news commentator who kind of articulates like a, republic versus democracy kind of distinction, which, would not be outright dictatorship, but would definitely be a curtailment of rights. And that's definitely someone to keep an eye on, like if he like ends up actually getting into Trump's government and lasting there, as one of the most dynamic representatives of that tendency. Someone this time around, who's actually in favor of dictatorship, like, be interesting to keep an eye on, Steve Bannon and anyone associated with him, on Elon Musk. But yeah, again, it's like a mishmash, and it's not like obviously the right wing doesn't have to be a politically coherent movement, not even to the extent that the left does. But it's important to recognize it is a mishmash of very, very different and in some cases opposing strategies that's at this point primarily motivated by self-interest. And that could cause enough turbulence to allow like a breakdown. And one element that's important to consider in that is that often the right wing and the left wing, both of them are motivated by a desire to preserve, to project, and to extend state power, and with it, the capitalist economic mode. The left tries to do that by having more of an emphasis on recuperating and institutionalizing claims from below. The left is better at kind of renovating the image and, the like participation in democratic systems. And the right is often kind of, reacting more to like perceived loss of entitlement, is trying to, strengthen more traditional, authoritarian, hierarchical, and oppressive values, even as they do often actually make innovative coalitions to do that. That's the simplification. Both of them are capable of more authoritarian or more participatory means, but, for a very rough generalization, that's kind of the difference. But it's interesting to see how, and this is definitely the case now, the right wing, by being so reactive to a perceived loss of special status or a perceived loss of privilege and entitlement, they actually often damage their own systems faster than the left. They're unable to see the loyalty to the system of the institutional left. And so they wage war simultaneously on the lower classes and on the left. and they don't see, that the left is often good at like smoothing over enormous existential problems like colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and all that. So the right wing strategies are very scary, especially to those to people who are not subjected to that level of violence, day in, day out under any kind of government. But also right wing strategies are often damage the longer term interests of the state and of capitalism. Yeah.
You've spoken previously about the ways that anarchists are often incorrectly lumped in with the left. And so I think you're already sort of getting to this point, but you've made this distinction between what you call the rank and file of the left and its leadership. And you've pointed out how leftist leadership wants to protect exactly what you were just saying, right? Protect and renovate state authority to improve strategies for social control, while right-wing leadership tends to weaken state power. And so I want to ask you more about the kinds of growth or diminishment of state power that we might be expecting to see on the horizon here in a minute. But in the meantime, I think this is an important, and Prince, I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on this too. An important question, right, is can you speak a little bit more about this distinction between leftists and anarchists? What do you think they have in common? Like, why are they so often lumped together? I think you're speaking a little bit to this just now, Peter, but where do you think they diverge? And similarly, why and how do you think it might be helpful or useful for anarchists to work with the rank and file of the left? And what about the rank and file of the right? I think maybe you were just speaking to this, but I wanted to draw that out.
I'll try to be a lot more brief this time. So this is another example of loss of historical memory. In most of the world, English, for whatever reason, or Anglophone cultures, especially prone to forgetting. But in most of the world, anarchists are not understood to be a part of the left. But that doesn't mean that they're equidistant between the left and the right. So originally, the term refers to the left side and the right side of the aisle. Of parliament, of congressional building. It stems from one of the French revolutions of the 1800s. So the left is a left wing of government focused institutions, ideologies, strategies. Or if it's like the very extreme left, then that can be referred to as the extra parliamentary left. So some kind of leftist approach that is so like extreme or more radical, which are also not synonyms, radical meaning like looking at the roots of the problem, that it's not currently at all represented in government or in the ruling class or anything like that, but still they're oriented towards the capture and renovation and change of state power. So, they don't want to win an election, they want to win a revolution, but they're still, whether they admit it or not, they're still going to renovate capitalism and keep capitalism running, just like with, the communist revolutions, which were state-oriented and leftist in Russia, Cuba, China, et cetera, which also continued, all like in Cuba, it continued the kind of colonial role assigned in the global economy to Cuba as a cash crop exporter. But, now in the Soviet sphere of influence in Russia, it preserved Russian imperialism and Russian white supremacy, in a reformed mode, and so on and so forth. Same with China. So it's really important to keep that distinction, to not forget that distinction, because we need to have an understanding of how power actually works, through mechanisms like recuperation, like the ability of people in power to say, or the ability to run an election, say, hey, all these police killings are a problem, or like, hey, all these deaths on the border, that really is a problem. Or this people's loss of healthcare, like, that's a problem. Like to kind of strike a sympathetic pose with, those of us who are facing, some or various of these kinds of violence, but to fool us into thinking that the state is the vehicle to solve those problems for us. So it keeps us disempowered. It keeps, our own organizational and creative power out of our hands, and it allows this constant extractivism of, both like, material wealth and creative wealth, creative resources, memory, knowledge, all of those things. It's all stolen from us and from, the living ecosystems of the planet constantly, and from the future and from the past, so that it can be controlled by a governmental machine. And that, that's a kind of machine that can work in a range of ways, but it cannot work outside of that range. It never has worked outside of that range. So it can never, by definition, it can never be an instrument of liberation. So that's why it's important to have that distinction about, what the left actually is. Most people who populate the left, though, are well-meaning. Most people who populate the left care about things like, racism and transphobia and sexism and borders and stuff like that. So it makes a lot of sense to communicate with them, but to kind of block the efforts of the institutions that regiment the left and the leaders of the left to expose and block their efforts to take away our power, to redirect our movements in self-defeating directions. And that's something that, and unfortunately, the kind of idea of like anti-fascist left unity played a small but significant role in this, like how much power we lost, say between 2017 when like we shut down all the airports in the country as a movement, to like block the Trump so-called Muslim ban through direct action when, the Democrats and all the NGOs couldn't do anything about it, to like after 2020, how quickly this amazing, the latest iteration in, these growing uprisings against white supremacy and against police killings, that spread, that it was, already spreading across the country and across the world, and really had a huge blow up again, a huge showing in 2020, along with the really, really important mutual aid efforts in the first year of the pandemic. How quickly that kind of fizzled and left people exhausted without a kind of radical framework of like imagining next steps, what directions to take that in, because, people had sort of been, like people were exhausted, and also certain pacification processes that were happening kind of without critical attention.
Yeah. Prince, I'm wondering if you wanted to jump in on this question too, of the distinction between the left and anarchism in general, and how you see that playing out or relevant, maybe even in some of the anti-repression work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question and a space to kind of think about, especially post this 2024 election, because I think that's where a lot of my thoughts around this question came to, because I was thinking of, I don't know, and it also kind of relates to the last question around like traditional or historical forms of fascism versus what we're seeing arise in the US right now with Trump, because I kind of think of them combined in a sense of like, I've had so many conversations with other Black folks since the election results where either some folks are angry that more people didn't vote for the candidate that represented the lesser evil to them, aka Harris, versus other people that are kind of like, oh, well, another Trump administration won't be that bad because there were other minority groups that kind of got put on the chopping block and Black people got a break. Like these are things that I've heard from Black folks in a variety of degrees. And when I hear these sentiments, I almost think about like, what is it about Trumpism that is becoming even more increasingly either attractive to people, or what is it about it that allows people to kind of be complicit or to allow it to exist? And I think in terms of like the last question and how it connects to this, I think there's a lot of like class consciousness and economic reasons that I think the US is kind of like, folks in the US have to wade through and kind of reorient themselves around. Because even earlier I was researching like Trump's cabinet, as far as like some of the numbers add up to, it's like they have a combined worth of over $340 billion. And so when I think about like this desire for wealth and what that means about inclusion in the empire, and how like for Black people specifically, there are these interesting questions of like, is this the hellscape that everyone is imagining, or is it just another thing that we have to survive? And then I think to the question of like the left versus anarchists, I just keep thinking about locally here in Columbus, where like there were a bunch of the U.S. encampment protests earlier this year. I remember there were some leftists that were organizing towards that, and they kept saying like, oh, we have to make sure the optics make sense. Like we have to make sure the optics can land in media and like blah, blah, blah. And I think about how, in my mind, a part of leftism is agreeing to the politics of optics. So agreeing to the relationships that activists, movements, organizations have with the mainstream media in order to gain kind of mainstream appeal, and what you sacrifice in terms of like oppositional tactics, fighting the cops, fighting the state, building a praxis around that, not snitching on people. And so I view that as like an area of concern and kind of like, I guess, separation that I feel in like a lot of larger leftist spaces. Because if folks are like really indebted to like the optics of something, I'm almost wondering like, where's the meat? What about this goes beyond performance? And then I think of like a real distinction for me is like a dedication to decolonization, because especially in that space of that movement this year, like I was organizing with Palestinians and Palestinian Americans, but where the tactics began to sway was, I don't know, I really struggled with how some parts of the local movement were just trying to like survive and have some kind of public facing kind of sentiment, as opposed to what is the opportunity in this moment to kind of express a decolonial logic, to find a decolonial tactic, to articulate how folks here and folks in Palestine and Gaza are fighting colonization, and how that should be central, and how, especially for me as a Black anarchist, I kind of demand a decolonial logic, because I can see how there are Black folks in the US who like align with the state, or they align with the logic of carcerality, or they view it as like a way for us to get to a better level or a better place in the hierarchy. And so I think that's another distinction like between left and anarchism. I think it's like, I question whether or not people want a place in the hierarchy, or if they want to be critical of the hierarchy and dismantle it. And then I also think another big thing is like looking forward at like the next 4 years or beyond, if you believe Trump is, or his administration is going to allow another election. But I think about how moving forward, we have to look at whether or not our modes of resistance are following like these logics of reform. So maybe changing a policy that reduces some of the state's power, but it doesn't really challenge the logic of the state whatsoever, versus something that's more abolitionist, which is how can we defund? How can we close down jails? How can we reduce the level of like private carcerality that is like a part of like the border and prisons and jails? Like, what are the ways that we can reduce the capacity of the system that we're living under? But I think the biggest thing for me personally is probably, where is our commitment to decolonization? Because I think in a lot of ways that to me, like, it's coupled with capitalism and white hegemony, but it's almost like, how do we go past that towards like, how have we all participated in the project of the American project of colonization or settler colonization. So I think it's all of those things for me, or at least that's what I've been looking at.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's sort of this, almost this weird catch-22, right? Of like participating in this structure in order to demolish it. And I think that sort of leads into this next question, right? Of regardless of if we call Trump a fascist or not, right? There's clearly a push by Trump and those in his orbit, even those that are falling in and out of favor in Trump world, like Bill Barr, for example. There's this push to amass power in the executive branch and push back against so-called checks and balances, insofar as they actually exist right now, right? Peter, let's start with you. What do you see Trump doing big picture-wise as president? How do you think he's going to use his power? And Prince, I'd like to hear your answer to this too. And of course, this is leading into like, how do we push back, which I'm hoping we can talk more about subsequently.
Yeah, instead of getting into like more specific policy predictions, because I just don't know, and I prefer to try to have kind of like focus on things that allow us to like respond with versatility and to build resilience like in like a range of outcomes. I think it can be important to distinguish between kind of two different parts of the Trump phenomenon, which, is also like a political phenomenon that's like, spreading in like a lot of other countries, like, like with Bolsonaro in Brazil and, a whole bunch of, sort of populist, like proudly corrupt, right wing, weird to call them charismatic because of how gross they are, but like to enough of the electorate charismatic politicians like in Europe as well. So I think it's important to move past the parts that are shock value, which are, and then it's not that those aren't dangerous, but I think we can distinguish between like what's dangerous for us and what's dangerous for, the more traditional governmental system of our enemies, in which, they were polite with one another as they were discussing, genocide and, welfare and surveillance and policing and all of that. Okay, so, these kind of newer right-wing politicians are proudly impolite, they're proudly inappropriate and not politically correct and all those things. That's more of a concern for people who care about maintaining democratic government, which is a colonial system. And I really appreciate, Prince, you centering the question of colonialism, as like an ongoing foundation of like that. That's the reason that these structures are global, because of a violent process of invasion, conquest, and colonization, which is ongoing and has to be ongoing, because it never, like, once it starts, it can't end until it's destroyed. So another part that's kind of dangerous about like the more shocking aspect of it is, like here in Ohio, like Jesus, the Republican campaign was based almost entirely on encouraging transphobia and encouraging xenophobia.
Very true.
Criminalizing and go ahead.
Just saying very, very true. Like, how many YouTube did I get about that? And it was fucking maddening.
Yeah, it was horrific. Just like incredibly like criminalizing and demonizing, like in the literal sense of both of those words, trans people, especially trans women and migrants. And that's actually dangerous, to things that are important, not to like, due process and, the, House of Representatives or whatever, but that's like important and threatening to life, because like that rhetoric translates into deadly attacks, and it translates into like dehumanizing processes in which the government can find complicity, among, some of those of us who are ruled, who are subject to state authority. So that's actually dangerous. On the other side of it, looking at the actual policy, I'm not sure how much of a departure we're seeing from, other presidential administrations, like in terms of police killings, in terms of, institutionalized murder on the border. It doesn't really change much, or, sometimes it gets worse under Democratic candidates. If you look at, like all of the millions of people in Southeast Asia killed by Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, it's comparable to the amount of killings that the U.S. is supporting or, directly carrying out nowadays. And like, those different politicians, they were, all, polite and like, avoided, doing the things that were politically incorrect in the moment to a certain extent. The only one of them who got any kind of consequences was, Nixon resigning for like, tampering with the electoral process. So there are differences here, but I think the most important things that we need to be, really responding to, pivoting towards, and preparing to resist are major questions of collective survival on a planetary scale, because of really it's one problem, but it has a lot of different facets, and all of these facets need to be addressed. They need, some of us need to have projects that focus on one facet or another, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we allow these to be viewed as separate problems. So the borders are inseparable from the ecological crisis, is inseparable from urban planning and industrialism, is inseparable from, bullshit green rhetoric about green growth and green capitalism and technological solutions, is inseparable from billionaires like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the new tech economy, is inseparable from, the right-wing push for more fossil fuels, because actually, this huge growth in expansion of AI, which is also related to surveillance, it requires, more green energy and more fossil fuel energy. And in fact, more investment in green energy causes more production of fossil fuel energy. And speaking of AI surveillance, I haven't checked the news in a couple hours. Hopefully there hasn't been any bad news, but, sending out a prayer and some good magic for, the person who just took care of one of these, horrible healthcare multimillionaire CEOs, as an act of self-defense, because, the health insurance industry kills people and it makes money off of denying the resources and the technologies that we as a society create to deal with health problems. The health insurance industry only makes its money by denying us those resources. And so that was someone who's, was making tens of millions of dollars every year by killing people. So I was actually, undergoing dental surgery, and was joking with a, student dentist the other day, like just this normal student dentist, and we were kind of joking about at least they got one of them. So.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm seeing some incredible memes coming out about that right now. Prince, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the things that I've especially been kind of orienting my brain around and trying to like research and study and understand more about, especially after spending the past month at the U.S.-Mexican border. I mean, I think naturally immigration and border policies and Border Patrol and ICE, like just materially thinking about all of the ways that folks along the border and other places where there are large migrant populations, how like looking at like private infrastructure around the border and detention and immigration, and how private facilities are a big part of the U.S.-Mexican border already, and thinking about how this might expand in other parts of the U.S. I think about the fact that the Trump administration is thinking about doubling the number of immigration and customs enforcement detention beds. I was reading that right now they allocate around 41,000, and they're probably going to look to increase that. I also think about just like how states like Texas have offered land in various capacities for mass deportation facilities. And I was recently listening to a podcast. I think it was Movement Memos, but they had a really good episode about how folks in the immigration and deportation space are thinking about like organizing around Trump and what kind of things folks will have to be looking out for. But I think even that as an issue in terms of like abolition and carcerality, and how 2020 was such a major flashpoint for a lot of different reasons, and how a lot of the mainstream kind of, I guess, attention around abolition has shifted, and how this new Trump administration, I guess, will represent another kind of challenge or opportunity for folks to kind of draw these connections between the border, between police and prison systems, between just like the different ways that carcerality can show up. And then I just think about like anti-media sentiments, like how the media landscape will change. Like right now, the Press Act is kind of being pushed through, and that's something that's a really popular bill that's being presented to protect press freedoms, and it would limit law enforcement surveillance of journalists and stop people from being able to sue a certain entity and then demand certain notes from a journalist, and like thinking of how sources can be protected. And so I think there are a lot of avenues of potential consciousness raising, and I also am of the mindset, like I think the first days and weeks and like month or two will kind of let us know how quickly out the gates the Trump administration will kind of be running. But I also think about just like as a gay guy that's never wanted to be married so far, but I don't know, I think about like how the Supreme Court and its shifting tone on right to privacy, how that's going to change reproductive rights even more drastically, how that's going to shift this whole movement around parents' rights and private choice for schools, and even like, to me, gay marriage. It's not like I want to be a part of this fucking major institution, but I think about the material reality of all of these social wins that the Democratic Party or the liberals or the progressives could kind of say like, look, our country's getting better. A lot of those things are going to be challenged and peeled back. And I think about the relationship between leftists and progressives and centrists and anarchists, and how are we thinking about the narrative of change or resistance that's going to inevitably come out of some of these more legal or Supreme Court oriented challenges to like people's like civil and human rights. So I kind of think about all of those arenas and how they might connect to like the work that people can do locally. But I don't know, as a gay man, I'm kind of like, I'm prepared for hate crimes to be on the rise. And what to protect myself and other people? It's like, how are we having those conversations?
Yeah. I think that's a really important point around like, what are these repeal of all of these sort of liberal social reform like wins over the course of the last, I don't know, decades? What's that going to instigate in the population? And I think this, again, y'all are really good at just like leading into the questions that I wanted to already ask. But Peter, I wanted to kind of come back to some of the books that you've recently published, right, around thinking about the importance of historical memory and intergenerational continuity in sustaining long-term movements, both as a way of maintaining and building off of past efforts, but also as a way of avoiding and repeating past mistakes. And I'm wondering if we can apply some of this to our current context, right? There's been, and you guys have both already mentioned this, but talk of mass deportations, and it reminds folks of the Muslim ban, which you already brought up, Peter, in 2017, when thousands of people ended up engaging in direct action to shut down airports where deportations were taking place. And a lot of people have pointed out that the state just doesn't have the infrastructure to carry out, the level of mass roundups that Trump is calling for. Yet we know there's going to be a bunch of attacks, as you just outlined, Prince. And so I'm wondering, let's talk a little bit more about these forms of resistance. You nodded at some of them that is that Kelly Hayes in Movement Memos was talking about. What is resistance actually going to look like, or might it look like, and how do we avoid past mistakes? How do we build off of past successes? And similarly, I think some of what you're just talking about, Prince, reminded me of an argument that I was hearing a lot in conversations around the election was that, basically shit is going to hit the fan and then everyone's going to wake up and people are going to be in the streets more and they're going to be participating more. And I wonder what you all think about that argument. How real does that feel to you? Does it feel like there's a potential for real revolutionary buildup here, or are people just going to be playing defense? And yeah, what does that look like?
Oh, this is such a good question. Oh, Lord. I mean, I have so many answers that I could give. I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting that we're getting another, I don't even want to say the word opportunity, but another opportunity to kind of look at what a Trump administration could mean. I think there's a lot of room to analyze what direct policies or ideologies or ideas will he just trying to continue from his last time in office, and what will be different this time around. I think a lot of the fear or worry that I have is centered around, I remember when Trump won the last time, there were a lot of folks that I knew that considered themselves leftists or whatever on some level. And there was this initial moment of paralysis, or this is so overwhelming. I can't really think about what we need to do or how things can change. And I guess a part of the reason that I theorized that Trump would win again is that I just think America is really good at repeating itself. And I wonder what echoes of that same paralysis will occur again, because I do think this year in particular has burnt out a lot of people. People have engaged in all sorts of movements that have faced countless forms of repression, the legal battles that have come up, the time that folks have spent in and out of jail, and how I fear that there is a level of burnout that's happening that is going to be one of the initial hurdles for people to kind of work through. But I do think one of the challenges of what we're going to be facing is how do we turn a very real reactionary empathy on the part of the mainstream or the centrists or the leftists into work that can help people kind of realize the core evils of the system, instead of organizing towards a better next 4 years the time around. How can we organize these movements and spaces in the inevitable reactions to kind of think about a deeper logic or theory of ungovernability or of resistance? And I feel like that's the kind of the shift that I'm really looking for. How can I be in movements where I'm being asked to be in solidarity with other people, or other people are being in solidarity with me? And maybe their ideology gives them a different kind of buy into the state, or what the state's capacity is if there's a better version. But what are the things that I can integrate into my organizing, or the ways that I challenge people, or the ways that I talk about my points of unity, where it does come back to that kind of decolonial logic. And I wonder what that looks like on a local level. And that to me kind of leads to, I think these formations of mutual aid and anti-fascism that will naturally arise need to not only serve the function of giving people resources, or offering I don't know, space for anti-fascism, but it being a longer form alternative, it being another way of living alongside the system that we have. I mean, I think of like Martin Saustrey's notion of like prefigurative politics, but those are some of my initial thoughts. But that was a tough question. I don't know.
Well, that's great. Peter, did you have thoughts there?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Prince said, and I agree how much of an initial hurdle kind of our collective exhaustion and grief is going to constitute. And so I think we need to be caring with one another and with ourselves, not in like the kind of like, individualistic, like, self-care, like, like kind of way of like where it's all kind of compartmentalized into individuals, but like, having like a kind of expansive and solidaristic empathy, and then not treating ourselves like machines. I guess maybe 4 points that I'll try to like give really like as quick as I can. I think it helps to recognize that I think for most people, many or most of our actions don't flow from our reasons, but rather will often invent reasons that justify the actions that, our context or our convenience kind of leads us to take. So like, what does that mean? Like, for example, if you give people a poll in in any normal day between like you vote for a Democrat, vote for a Republican, support, total revolution and total change, like, the revolution vote is, probably not even gonna get 1% because it's just, no one feels that it's on the table. But then like these same exact people, put them in the context of June 2020, when police stations around the country are getting burned down. And that's what's meant by Black Lives Matter. That's what's meant by, police abolition and abolition of the prison system. That movement that was actively taking over streets, fighting with cops, trashing banks and burning down police stations, pulled higher, like got like a higher support, percentage in massive polling than either Biden or Trump. Right. So when we make something possible, we also make it more attractive. And we can see the same thing in insurrections in the last couple of decades around the world, that movements that are very minoritarian, movements that don't seem to have a lot of support, when they have more strength, they get more support. It doesn't often work the other way around. Or I mean, like they can't wait around for the support to like, build strength. Another thing is that these kind of uprisings, these rebellions, they do happen magically. Like there's definitely a lot of magic there, but magic does not mean out of thin air. They don't just, come out of nothing. The anti-police rebellions that have been growing for the last couple decades came in large part out of decisions that were made amongst groups of friends, amongst affinity groups, in different circles that, coincidentally were kind of happening around the same time in different cities around the country, among like, relatively small groups of people deciding not to let like a single other police murder, like not one more police murderer can go by, in our city or in our neighborhood without some kind of real response. And, that kind of real response would be like, whatever folks have the strength to put together, whether that's like, if it's, if they can only have like, there's only like a dozen people or 2 other people that they trust, at the very least, like smashed out windows at like some banks and police stations. If it's 100 people, it means like, taking over a street and fighting with the cops. If it's 1,000 people, it means, trying to do the same to the precinct. If it's 10,000 people, if it's 100,000 people, it means taking over the city and burning down every police station in the city. And like that decision started from like small groups. It wasn't people just like waiting around. It was people saying like, we can't control the masses, and we don't aim to, but we aim to create new tools and new possibilities of response for ourselves. And we're going to try to do it in a strategic way so that it's inviting to other people. And so if other people want to use this tool, if other people want to do this alongside us, they are more than welcome, and we'll do our best to keep one another safe. And like, it's like that can't be done with a geometric expectation that, first time it'll be 10 people, the next time it'll be 100 people, like it will grow exponentially. Like there's no linear growth in revolutionary struggles. Like there's ebbs and flows. There's moments in which we need to put down stronger roots, and there's moments in which we get to send out blossoms of fire into the world. There's moments in which we need to heal. There's moments in which we need to learn and remember. And also different people are going to be in different moments of the same thing. And when we're doing it well, that comes together as an ecosystem where my vital activity supports your vital activity, supports their vital activity, supports her vital activity. And we make each other stronger. And in the places where we don't disagree, we just accept that there's going to be conflict and difference, or sometimes some distance. And that's okay, as long as we're able to distinguish between what poisons the ecosystem, aka political parties, big NGOs, authoritarian tendencies and movements, reformism that involves selling people out, things like that. We got to distinguish the things that kind of poison the soil for everyone from the things that are, not our preferred strategy, things that we might have even strong disagreements with, but we can accept, like, okay, there's like some legitimacy there. There's some validity there. Those people should, be able to exercise that method of struggle, and maybe we'll all learn something from it. So I don't even remember if that was point 2 or 3, but, we definitely need to focus on building up our infrastructure where we can, but also remembering that, if we have a social center, if we have a resource distribution network following like a model of solidarity and mutual aid, the most important thing is not the building. The most important thing is not the physical project. The most important things are the experiences that we take from that and the relationships that we build up during that. Because those are the strong, like if they're healthy, they're the most versatile, they're the most able to adapt to pick up and put down roots in a new place if we have to survive repression. So many movements have like squatters movements, for example, that have, liberated buildings from the regime of private property, like hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings for social centers, for housing, for clinics, for show spaces and art spaces, and you name it, have often mistaken like that physical wealth, that physical victory for the most important thing. And so then they've made self-defeating compromises to protect the physical wealth. So legalization of the movement, or, it could be like the change of laws to we think that that's going to like preserve some kind of victory that we've won in our struggles. But, hopefully we can see with with Dobbs, like the loss of guaranteed abortion rights, and, the fact that like legislation, which was originally intended to placate anti-racist movements and ensure that, racist discrimination in the workplace wasn't legal, is now used to like protect, white people supposedly, who are being discriminated against. Like it makes it illegal to have anti-racist hiring practices. We need to remember that any kind of victory that is encoded in law is out of our hands. That is not something that we have power over. We have power over our own activity, our relationships, our strategies, how we choose to respond. And we'll only be somewhat safer if they're afraid of us, and we'll only be like fully safe and able to kind of pivot towards like, the huge problems if, we've destroyed the state and capitalism. So the final thing I guess I want to say is this might not help for other people. This might be actually really weird for other people. I think it's really important to find some strength and some solace, acknowledging that the apocalypse has already begun, and that mass death, mass extinction, it's already here. Some indigenous comrades like have shared with me the perspective, and it's a fairly common sentiment, like, saying like, for us, the apocalypse began 500 years ago, kind of reacting like a kind of like, reacting with frustration about like a kind of more like, global north or middle class or like white perspective of like, is the world going to end? Is there going to be like, big old apocalypse and all that? And it's been happening for a while now. It's spreading. But so anyways, like an awareness of, let's just look at the ecological crisis, just one small aspect of it. It's too late to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And because of a variety of tipping points, the likely change is the high probability change is over 3 degrees Celsius of warming, between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius of warming, which is absolutely fucking catastrophic. That triggers multiple tipping points. It's, it means the rapid and catastrophic change of nearly every ecosystem on the planet, one of the largest mass extinction events in the history of the planet. We'll go from tens of millions of people dying, of human people, tens of millions of humans dying every year as a result of this kind of ongoing catastrophe, to hundreds of millions dying every year. This has already started. This is accelerating. We're in it. It doesn't look like a Hollywood movie. It's not like, someone flicks a switch and all of a sudden everyone's killing each other for food. Like, actually, you see more instances of mutual aid breaking out because, our neighbors and strangers and like other people, and people does not include cops. People does not include politicians. People does not include millionaires. They're humans, but they're not people. Real people are like the ones who will save us, in the next hurricane, in the next wildfire, if we're in one of these territories that's experiencing mass starvation. I think we need to find some kind of stability in that whirlwind. I think we need to recognize like it is too late to stop certain things. So it honestly helps talking with leftists. Like, we can just kind of look at them like they're really, really behind the times, and like, the things that they want to save are already dead. They just haven't realized it yet. Industrial agriculture is already a failed system. It can't feed the global population anymore. So we need, as a matter of survival, to take over land, to start healing the land, healing the soil, to destroy colonial modes of agriculture, to do our best to support indigenous struggles, gaining their land back, and also being able to reapply their locally developed technologies for growing food, for feeding themselves, feeding one another, and healing the ecosystems. And those of us who are not indigenous support that and adapt it, and adapt to the land that we're living on, the land that's hosting us, and help heal that land as quickly as possible, along with all the other things that need to go with it. Like, the millions of deaths, it's already happening, and the state and capitalism are living on borrowed time. Things look a lot better the sooner that we can abolish the state and abolish the capitalism and abolish all of the institutions that go along with it, so that so we won't have these like fucking stupid cops and white supremacists and millionaires to deal with anymore. We can prioritize our collective survival and healing.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about, especially this question of like urgency. Yeah, sort of. There's a lot of framing of the ecological crisis as something that is coming, something that we're doomed to experience as though it's not already here, and that has a way of not only sort of centering the global north in that process, but also basically cutting people off from their own agency and their own ability to act. And this is something that I think a lot of indigenous land defenders talk about, is thinking of our relationship to this on a much longer time scale helps us avoid falling into a lot of false solutions and this sort of fake sense of urgency that is a major motivator of a lot of the kind of green capitalist solutions that we hear about, and a major motivator of like putting us in different categories and different single issue campaigns that ultimately fracture our movement. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I want to be kind of mindful of time here. Prince, I'm curious, since you've done some work in like supporting people with legal struggles who are engaging in direct action, and you talked about the Boeing case earlier, maybe you could talk a little bit about like how you see people pushing back on the kind of weaponization of old laws that we can anticipate from Trump, that you've already outlined some of those.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of it to me comes down to both the area of opposing repression, where we're dealing with like the legalistic aspects of it. So building out legal defense networks, finding reliable lawyers and attorneys that are willing to like kind of follow movement strategies in terms of like dealing with like the aftermath of direct actions or people being targeted. Even with the Boeing 5 case that happened like here in Ohio, like that was in Heath, Ohio, and that was a protest that occurred in like a part of the state where it's like a lot of people work at some of those weapons manufacturers or have ties to those industries. And so on a socio-political level, there are a lot of like obstacles in terms of like strategizing around what are the judges going to think in terms of this case? What is the prosecutor thinking? How are these local kind of, I don't know, parts of the legal system in this particular place in Ohio affecting like how we organize and try to oppose the repression happening to these folks? But I mean, I think a lot of it for me comes down to like that above ground, front facing legal defense work, and then also kind of maybe to our points about like going beyond like the logic of reform or working towards a kind of new normal, because that's what I kept kind of thinking about throughout this whole conversation around how when I was watching the election and the different things with Kamala and her different events, like a lot of her rhetoric was like, we are never going back. We're never going back. And I'm thinking, we're already fucking here. Like, what the fuck? Like, you want a black person to sell me imperialism? And so I think to Peter's point, it's gonna be so necessary that we organize not around getting a better administration in or having like a better kind of mayor or candidate in city council, but it's kind of like to that long game of like, what is the decolonial logic behind the things that we're doing? And I think in terms of legal defense work, it's going to need to be eventually like, what do we do when we want to have direct actions or revolutionary acts of resistance where you don't want someone to be caught up in being entangled in the carceral system? How are you going to house someone? What are the safe house networks? And if we're asking those questions in terms of legal repression and old laws coming back and folks being targeted, those same questions can apply to the anti-deportation work and mutual aid work that's going to be involved in opposing ICE. And so I think it's important to be reactive to the policies and things that are going to be brought forward or brought back, but it's also important to view that resistance in terms of like a longer struggle that inevitably wants to disentangle people altogether from having to engage with the state or carcerality or detention or prisons. But I think a lot of it to me comes down to like there's a lot of material drain that comes with like, I guess, above ground mainstream anti-repression work. And I've been thinking towards like, how can the folks that I know build like those more underground structures that help people avoid even getting caught in the first place? I don't know. So I think there's a lot of like, I guess, responses I have, but it does come back to this resistance from like the mainstream or the maybe the mainstream left, where it's like, we need to just return to like the normal that we had before. Like we need to go back to our post-racial America. And I think the challenge is like getting people to realize that's a past that doesn't even exist for some people anymore. And it never has.
Yeah, it brings up this interesting question for me that I kind of wonder what you all think about this. Like, is it worth trying to, like, if we're seeing ourselves moving in a direction where there's going to have to be a building up of underground capacity at the same time as maybe we're seeing people continue, especially people who haven't been super politically active over the course of the last 4 years, like maybe finding their footing in more above ground, like public facing actions? Is it worth trying to do a lot of like the sort of educational work or the communications work of reaching people in that group to, I guess, normalize some of the tactics that we can expect to be happening underground? Does that make sense? Like basically getting people to realize that like property damage is great. Property damage can be effective. Like this nonviolent versus violent binary is harmful. Like, is that conversation worth trying to have with a like progressive liberal public or not?
I think the public as the public is kind of an abstract entity, which is sort of produced by the media, whatever the media of a society happened to be. So it's easier to manipulate. It's kind of a product rather than just the grouping of people. I think it makes a lot of sense to educate and to communicate. The better connected we are, the more entangled we are with other people, the harder it will be for the state to separate us out and to repress us. Because repression on a strategic level is, among other things, an act of enclosure. And so if there's no easy way for them to build a wall all around us, it's harder for us to be repressed. Whereas many movements that have kind of fetishized clandestinity in a not very strategic way have actually kind of enclosed themselves. There are certainly many underground skills and resources that we need to survive, but it needs to, the technique should never outweigh the kind of strategic analysis, and the strategy shouldn't outweigh a sense of like where the world is, where we are, and what we need. So like where we have, relationships, whether it's coworkers, neighbors, or things like that, like it absolutely makes sense to communicate, to try to convince people, and also recognizing that action often communicates and educates more than words. Like people have an easier time empathizing with and supporting or participating in the destruction of the kinds of property that is a threat to our health, whether it's like shutting down a gas pipeline, or shutting down a weapons factory, shutting down all of the vehicles in a police parking lot, things that are dangerous to us, things that are bad for life. People have a better time of understanding how that's like a useful and a necessary thing to do, and supporting it in some way, or maybe even doing it themselves if it's happening, and especially if it's happening in a way if it's happening in a better way. Like, for example, if what you're doing in that moment to support the struggle and to be a part of the struggle is like bringing your 3-year-old to like a big protest march so that they can also be a part of the movement and like grow up in this struggle, and then someone who you can't tell how green and afraid they are because they're masked up smashes the window, or right next to your 3-year-old, that's not a great way of doing that. And often like when people who are who've taken on that role of kind of showing up as like the fighters, when they act like that, it's often either because like they're inexperienced and have not found a way to like be honest about their fears, or to connect with people who have who are more calm in those situations because they've done it more times, or because they're not understanding themselves as a part of an ecosystem. They're not understanding that like they need to be there to help protect the 3-year-old and the parent and the old person and everyone else, that we all need to show up for one another. And then that reinforces this whole completely unhelpful and not very accurate nonviolence violence dichotomy that you named.
Thanks. Prince, did you want to weigh in on that? And then I have one more question.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good question that I've been thinking about so much. I mean, I literally did an interview with a former Black Panther Party member like a few weeks ago, and I was like, what do you basically about this question, like how do you work in movements where people might try to sell you out to the state, and like what do you do, or what's your advice? And she was just like, I don't know, it's case by case. And so I think on one level my mind kind of goes there, but I do think the conflict I feel in the question is, like to Peter's point, not wanting anarchist ideology or more antagonistic tactics to be seen as like siloed or insular or a part of a particular vanguard that like maybe pushes out this idea that they can lead and kind of lead the way for folks, versus, or like if the masses can kind of apply this kind of vanguard logic to the more kind of like, I guess, militant or antagonistic forms of resistance. But I do think it feels like it's a time and a place kind of thing. Like I do think it's important for folks to be able to organize with each other in terms of a diversity of tactics, and for there to be kind of like a baseline respect of like some of those like core values. Like with some of the recent humanitarian aid work I was doing at the border, like there were different groups that had different approaches. There were some that were more harm reduction oriented. There were some that were more religious, other folks that were kind of in between. But I saw those groups, they were able to be in solidarity with each other because they agreed upon at least trying to remedy the harm that the state operates as just on a bare bones functional level in terms of immigration and border enforcement. Like it's not there to help people. It's there to push people into corridors of the desert where they're more likely to die or like have their aid slashed. But I do think if we're thinking of like trying to change something as like a path, I think there are points in the path where our ideologies or our tactics or our worldviews diverge. And I feel like confronting that point is kind of where I'm kind of working through in most of my political life and work, because even in this conversation, I've kept thinking like, how do I talk to other Black people about class consciousness if they've just bought into like, I need to get mine and help my own, and how that is like toxic and not good to me. And some people that might think that might sell out their neighbor or might, I don't know, like do whatever. And so I think it's maybe for me about being practiced in conversations around class consciousness and really demanding or challenging people to be more in solidarity with other folks that have a different class or even like level of documentation or whatever it may be, and being really clear about the ways that, like, I guess me and other folks of color can also do the work of the colonizer, and recognizing those moments and trying to intervene and be really direct. And then I think it's about like movements doing that necessary work of, I don't know, like being in solidarity or having a diversity of tactics, but also knowing when to kind of scale back and have the resources to protect the more militant aspects of the movement work. So I really feel like it's a case by case thing that I'm literally discovering, but I think it's going to be important in terms of like arguing people against like, we're not returning back to normal. Like, normal never really existed. It's never existed for so many people on this land for so long. And so it's kind of like, I think almost like instead of arguing about tactics or how we change things, it's almost like arguing towards a shared vision of what is actually happening. And I feel like that's the work I'm trying to get to and work through, I don't know, day by day.
Yeah, totally. And it leads into my last question for y'all is, I think there's this call right now in the run up to Trump's inauguration for people to be holding big public events and mass assemblies and really like starting to get to know each other and pull people in. What do you all think people should be doing right now to prepare for what's going to happen? And what kinds of, I think more importantly, what kinds of questions should people be asking each other? And yeah, what are some, I think we've been talking about this throughout this interview, but what are some important lessons from distant and recent past that might be helpful for folks to keep in mind as they begin to think about resistance in this new context?
What do we have? What do we need? What do we think we might be able to get away with? What are the risks that we're each facing, and how can we support one another, understanding that those risks are different person to person, and the needs? How can we include more people in this conversation, and who? And the answers are going to be completely different from one territory to the next.
Great. Thanks.
I guess I really think about like, I don't know, I've been thinking like very bird's eye and all these massive things and almost kind of psyching myself out. And I feel like certain conversations I've had with folks in the past few weeks have kind of helped center me like back a little bit. But I think one thing that it comes down to for me is like materially, if you are a part of a community, if you live in a city or a town, who are the decision makers, the stakeholders? What are the opportunities to kind of observe and understand what kind of things these people have their pulse on, and what kind of legislation can they be presenting? Are there going to be new ICE facilities that could be presented in your city? Are there going to be changes to the way the education system works, changes to the curriculum? How can we materially kind of observe and note and understand and document the processes that the state is using to disenfranchise us? And how can we build out processes of like that being shared community work, whether it's like you have folks in your anti-fascist organization that are like showing up to city council meetings on a bi-weekly basis, taking notes on what kind of policies or bills they're presenting, what kind of funding changes are happening in terms of police departments. And some of that for me is materially like, I do think there's this dangerous aspect of the pendulum swinging back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, where if it's a more Democratic candidate, so many aspects of the left kind of feel like, oh, like now's the time where we just like kind of demand reform and like kind of edge things towards it getting a little better. And I think we have to like really view the state as being antagonistic and encouraging like our modes of organizing to kind of take that seriously. And so I think like documentation, mining like what like local politicians and private corporations are doing, and then saying what kind of community do we want to have and what kind of institutions do we want to have or don't want to have in our communities. And so that's one area of it. And then I just think beyond that, it's just really starting with the basics, which for me has come back to community, holding space for people, showing up in both a socially caring way, but a politically caring way, figuring out the questions I need to ask myself as like a queer Black person, like, what do I feel like I need to feel safe, and how can I talk to other folks that I know so we can kind of be on the same page in terms of that. And I think if we can start building out these kind of processes of care, these processes of documenting and observing what the state is doing, then we can begin to kind of establish what the playing field is that we're working on, and what are the ways that we want to change these material conditions. If your local schools and curriculums are being peeled back and erasing entire aspects of history, what are the modes of childcare that we can build out of these mutual aid systems that are happening? If the cops are coming into your neighborhood and fucking people up, or militias are coming through and going to your state house, what are the groups of people in your community that are willing to be a part of a hotline that can be alerted and they get told a location that they need to go to and what you might have to be ready for when you show up there? And so I think it's about building out these like very material kind of neighborhood watches, mutual aid systems, legal defense networks, and building up enough, I guess, base power so that these infrastructures and systems and modes of organizing can be malleable and change. And those are some of the places my mind kind of naturally goes.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, finally, I mean, is there I really appreciate this conversation, and thanks to both of you for sharing. Is there any sort of final points that you all want to make, or maybe places that people can find your work that you want to plug before we end here?
Yeah, first, just that I really appreciated being a part of this conversation with both of you. And yeah, the conversation never ends. The people who take part in it, we come and go. Yeah, for folks who want to find some more of my work for free, I have a newsletter on, Substack, whatever, just my name, Peter Gelderloos, Substack, I don't know, whatever, it's there. And then the Anarchist Library is a great resource. theanarchistlibrary.org is just a great resource for literally thousands of anarchist texts for free by a whole bunch of people. And then also I'm in the middle of releasing a 3-part video series with the great folks at Submedia. So for folks who kind of like, short videos more, the first one is out and 2 more are on the way. What's that called? I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, something like Revolution or Death.
I guess I'll just say that I hope that folks listening kind of center around the fact that like there's a lot to be worried about, but this is also simultaneously a continuation of systems that folks have studied and bared witness to and resisted for centuries. And so I think like grounding ourselves in that history is really important. Like even in preparation for this interview, like I was researching like anti-racist skinhead movements that were happening in Minnesota and like the ties for that to Jamaica and ska, and some of that shit I didn't know as deeply as I should have, even though my family's Jamaican. And so I think there are opportunities for folks to tap into their own individual cultural collective histories that I think is really, really important. And if folks want to like find me or any of my stuff out there, I do a lot of videos online about anti-capitalism, Black anarchism on YouTube. Just find my name, Prince Shakur. I also do a podcast called The Dugout, where me and my co-host Jordan talk about media, news, politics, theory, a bunch of different things. And that's like a really deep project of love for me. But yeah, folks can find me on either of those places or just online. Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us, and we'll link to all of your links in the show notes as well. Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchists and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.